Welcome to the Dignity Negotiation, a podcast series from the Dignity Code exploring how institutional systems shape human agency, legitimacy, and the conditions under which dignity is either cultivated or constrained. This is the episode 5 of season 1, Dignity in Education. Today's conversation examines a growing contradiction within the modern systems. Creativity is often celebrated as one of the highest human capacities. Schools claim to cultivate it. Organizations demand it. Innovation has become a global virtue. And yet, many organizations continue rewarding what is standardized, predictable, measurable, and professionally legible. So, what happens to forms of thinking that do not easily fit institutional expectations? Who gets to define what gets recognized as creative? Who gets to dismiss a part of human thinking as unrealistic, disruptive, unprofessional, or difficult to classify? And what happens to societies when divergence itself slowly becomes a form of risk? To explore these questions, I'm joined today by Dr. Yong Zhao, Foundation Distinguished Professor in the School of Education at the University of Kansas, whose work across decades has examined globalization, creativity, learning systems, and the future of education in age of technological and institutional transformation. Professor Zhao, welcome to the Dignity Negotiation.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
When institutions publicly claim that they value creativity, what do they actually mean in practice?
Well, I think every organization claims that they value creativity from government agencies to schools, from businesses to nonprofit organizations, from teachers to parents to students. Everybody thinks they value creativity, and everybody is trying to promote creativity. However, in practice, creativity is quite suppressed because we try to teach people to be creative in their own way. But human beings are creative; that we are born creative, and but that creativity is often suppressed.
Creativity is often suppressed. What kind of individuality are easiest for systems to actually celebrate publicly? And what form of creativity do you think is mostly suppressed?
Well, I mean, I think creativity is basically a concept to say people wants to do something original, wants to do something meaningful for others. But in our practice, parents want good children. That means they comply. Schools want good students. That means they comply with the task, with the work, with the test, with the examinations. And organizations often want people to comply with what they think is meaningful. So I think the idea of creativity is very appealing, but the practice of creativity of individuals in any organization is difficult, not because people are not creative, but people learn not to be creative because people are typically rewarded to be compliant. If you follow, if you comply, if you don't present challenges, you are much better off in any place, schools, families, organizations.
What forms of creativity actually remain institutionally safe?
Well, I think, people can be creative in complying. For example, you may have different ways to comply with the rules. Some students can be creative in meeting the requirements of teachers. You do homework in different ways, but those what I would call a minimized. That's externalized. Genuine creativity comes from individual intentions, comes from intrinsic motivation. So, like in any organization, people can and often do find different ways to make their bosses happy, to make teachers happy, to make parents happy. So those are what I call lower level externalized creativity instead of intrinsic creativity, that you want to do something original, you want to do something meaningful. I think people, when we talk about creativity, we don't talk about the different levels of creativity. You have the high level, low level, different types. I think we need to think about creativity along different paths, instead of trying to think creativity is one thing. Because what you create can be large and can be small. What you create can be truly meaningful or can be just trying to meet certain standards.
Why are institutions so inherently uncomfortable with forms of thinking that they cannot easily classify, measure, or standardize?
Well, you have to think it this way. It's that all institutions, they were developed for a purpose. And in a time of massive changes, and the foundation of those institutions may be challenged for good or for bad. So the challenge often comes from creative ideas. So the first thing organizations may feel scared is that they may not have to exist more, anymore. So our organizations can be gone, can be destroyed, can be removed. So that really threatens a lot of organizations. And every organization has a culture, has a history, has different habits. And again, creative people may challenge those. And if you challenge them, the organizations again may cease to exist. But some organizations, some institutions would like that. They are proud of being innovative. They're proud of being able to change. However, there are many organizations who don't want to change, so they would view creative ideas as challenge, creative ideas as a threat. So therefore, they want to suppress them.
Are all forms of creativity actually suppressed? What kind of uncertainties do institutions struggle to tolerate?
Well, you have to think this way. Not all creativity is good. Okay, so we have to say this. Creativity can be actually quite bad. You have a lot of criminals who are creative, who try to do certain things. You have a lot of bad people who use creativity to destroy humanity and human civilizations. So creativity itself is not necessarily good. So you want people, to be ethical, to be moral in using their creativity. Some creativity actually needs to be suppressed. You want to do something that's good for humanity, that's good for others, that's good not only for yourself. So that's why, I've been talking a lot about human interdependence. You want people to rely on each other, to depend on each other, to work for each other. So creativity has to be channeled, and some creativity has to be suppressed. We need to think about ethics, the morality of our work in relationship to humanity, to human beings, to human civilization.
You have mentioned that institutions often demand humans to comply. At what point does standardization stop functioning as a structure and begin functioning as behavioral conditioning?
Well, I mean, I think it's institutions in many ways. They they demand compliance, but also institutions. Depending on which organization we're talking about, there are all kinds of institutions, from millions of them. But institutions may have different desire leadership, but in order to cultivate or support creativity, they need to create space for individuals to be agentic, to have agency, to have intrinsically driven motivation to do something meaningful, to encourage people to be ethically creative.
Schools and workplaces are very good at teaching people how to perform competence. But at what point does mastering institutional game begin to erode genuine intelligence?
I don't think there's any one place particularly. What you need is a culture that celebrates individual contributions. It's a culture that values human individuality. It's a place that enables individual humans to work for each other to cultivate what I call human interdependence. So I think there are many places in any country, in any place, that does this. And of course, there are many organizations that don't do this. I think we, as one globe, one human civilization, needs to grow more institutions. It needs to grow more schools that celebrates the individual contribution to others, the individual greatness, the individual creativity for other people.
How much do class, language, professional culture, or even personality shape whose divergence gets nurtured and whose gets dismissed as illegitimate or unprofessional?
Well, I think, from an equity perspective, we have a lot of bias against people. Look at schools reproduce the hierarchy, or we call meritocracy. The wealthy, the rich people get a lot more opportunities, and the poor people in any society, and the poor people from poor countries are much less valued. And the wealthy and the powerful sets the rules, the standards to make judgment of the less resourceful people. That's why I think in this age, the less resourceful people, the people who come from poor regions, poor areas, poor families, poor communities, poor countries, have to take action to really fight against the standards instead of following the standards, because a lot of those standards are a way to exploit the less powerful people, to force the less powerful people to play the upper class game. That's really problematic. Language is used the same way, culture is designed in this way. I think this is a time for people to change, to think that everybody is valuable, to think that everybody can contribute, to think that everybody is uniquely great.
That is a great point, Professor. And this leads me to the next question. Genuine thinking is often uncertain. As you said, the real thinking of human being is uncertain, non-linear, and unfinished. But professional systems reward polish, coherence, uncertainty. So what happens to human development inside that contradiction?
I think what you said is really significant. Uncertainty is where we live. But traditionally, schools always try to cultivate children for certainty. We used to believe there's a certain future that we can help our children grow into, to learn into that future. I think uncertainty is key. So human development needs to deal with not existing certain problems, but uncertainty is the problem. So, how do we become resilient, adaptive, sensitive to uncertainties. And uncertainties brings opportunities. Uncertainty brings risks. Uncertainty brings good fortune and bad fortune. It all depends on how we react and how we perceive those changes. Schools needs to change the mindset about certainty. Instead of certainty, we need to think about uncertainty. It also means that uncertainty allows you to create new possibilities, to create new certainties. So I think every individual student, every individual person needs to learn to create new things instead of just trying to meet whatever the society gives them.
So, do institutions prematurely force humans into stable identities?
It does. And institutions want to force you to become a stable because they want to count on you. However, that dream doesn't exist because today, I mean, every day we see new changes, we see new possibilities, we see new disasters. Human beings need to learn how to react to them. I think all human beings have to think about, like your title says, dignity. Every individual deserves to be treated with dignity. Everybody is born with dignity, and that dignity has to be respected and preserved.
What makes unfinished thinking become threatening rather than valuable?
All thinking in many ways is unfinished. We learn to continue, we learn to revise, we learn to abandon, we learn to grow new ideas. So I think overall, human beings needs to have something very basic, that's dignity. At the same time, we will have be dealing with different events, different people, different things. So we have to think about how we create new possibilities for ourselves and for others, and how we react to others, to world events, and to new innovations with dignity. I like your title a lot. It's human dignity drives our thinking, drives our reactions to other people.
One reason this conversation feels especially urgent now is because AI is forcing institutions to confront assumptions they may have postponed for decades. So, has AI exposed weakness that already existed within educational systems built around memorization, procedural correctness, and answer production?
Oh yeah, I mean, AI is challenging human beings and human institutions in many ways, but the most fundamental things is that AI is able to do a lot of cognitive tasks that we train our people to do, we used to do. It is smarter in many ways than human beings already. You don't have to wait for long. So this is a way to rethink about the existence of human beings, and to rethink about what we can do, what we should do in the age of artificial intelligence. So it's challenging all our assumptions about what human beings are, what human labor, human workers are, and we have to reorganize our organizations. We have to rethink about our tasks. We have to rethink about what counts as success and what counts as failure because of AI's capability to do better than a lot of human beings.
So, if machines increasingly handle replication tasks effectively, what distinctly human capabilities become more important moving forward?
Well, I'm not sure. I think we're all still debating about that. However, we can think about meaning. Human beings can think about meaning and purpose. AI tools don't do that. Like, for example, AI can give you a lot of answers, but it needs questions. And why do questions matter? because in our society we have so many problems, so many questions we need to be answered, but only human beings can impose those questions and can ask them because they have meaning. Second thing that human beings do is we interact with the real people globally or locally. And AI does not have that understanding. AI is, you even in your own community, you go out, deal with people, but AI does not understand the local knowledge and local things. And then building human relationships. AI does not yet build human relationships. You have human beings have to be related. Human beings have to care about others. AI doesn't do that. AI does not drive that. Well, another thing is like human beings make value judgment. Should we do this? Who cares? Who benefits? Who gets hurt? Human beings have to make those judgments. I don't think AI can do that. So AI can do a lot, but the fundamental human values relationship value is still human.
Will institutions genuinely rethink education, or mostly they preserve themselves through adaptation?
Well, that's very true. But again, so that's why I started a new program called the Courageous Minority. I want individuals who are not in very powerful positions to start transformation, to make changes, to preserve the humanity. I think, like you're doing the podcast. You don't know who you might influence. You don't know, but you're doing something meaningful. You're doing something useful. I think every human being is in a position to do something better for others. But that what they need is not relying on institutions, but relying on individuals. I don't think, relying on big institutions is the best way to move forward.
You mentioned the courageous minorities. What does it require to
Nothing.
become one of these folks?
Well, first, I need to be courageous. I think every institution has a few people who wants to do something innovative, and they need to basically not complain about how the institution constrains them, how rules constrain them. They just to say, I can do something. Every human being can do something. Every human being has controllable space, but not every human being has the courage, has the belief that they can make changes. So I want those courageous minority to start lead, to start doing something in their own space.
You mentioned that it takes so much effort to be courageous, but is this due to individual failures or the system's requirement and all the means of survival when they are attached to such obedience you mentioned? Actually, is that the individual moral failure or it's the system that has already failed them?
Well, I think it's very complex. Human beings, like we said before, are not rewarded for being different, not rewarded for being innovative, not rewarded for trying to do something different. And there's also like a cognitive, level. I think a lot of human beings, they do not look at long term, they look at short term. They look at today, if I did this, what will happen? The courageous minorities actually, they're able to do that because they can ignore a lot of current pressure. There's a Chinese saying that if you don't have long-term worries, you have to be worried about everything happening to you today. But worrying about the short term does not work. But most human beings are wrapped in short-term outcomes. They're worried about today, they're worried about tomorrow. They're not worried about 10 days, 20 days later, or 20 years later, 30 years later. Human beings, I think, when you talk about on your podcast, you really have to focus on human beings. Maybe you can ignore a lot of today's problems when you invent something new. We are always bounded by past problems, existing problems. But when you invent something new, maybe those problems would disappear. That would change. So I would encourage a long-term perspective of human life, and then that may get you to become more courageous, because a lot of times we have imagined difficulties. So everybody imagine, I cannot do this, I cannot do that, but in reality you can do a lot, but we cannot imagine that. So long-term, broader perspective helps.
Now, let us again reflect on why some people fail to become part of such courageous minorities. Actually, what is the cost of divergence?
Well, I think, again, if you think about how difficult it is to be different, because everybody demands you, again, from your community, your friends, your family, your teachers, your bosses, they all want you to comply. They want you to be the same. So you are enculturated into thinking you have to be the same. But in reality, if you did something different, you might create a new community. Like, when you are doing this podcast, you're in India, I'm in the US, we can talk. So small minorities can have majority globally. You may not be liked by your local community, but you can be liked globally. So you can ignore, technology makes it possible to ignore local communities. You form global communities. You formulate different kind of tasks and jobs. So I would like to say, for our thinking, it is very important for you to think beyond your immediate constraints, to think about global possibilities.
Right. The habits we cultivate in education rarely remain in static classrooms. How do these ideas around conformity, legitimacy, readability, and risk scale outward into workplaces, governance, medicine, and public life?
We have to analyze this in much more detail than we can do on the podcast. However, if you look carefully, you have to examine what makes conformity meaningful, what defines legitimacy, what defines professional. All of this can be re-examined in different communities, in different cultures, in different societies. What's viewed, for example, as very good conformity in some religion is rejected by other religions. What is viewed normal and legitimate in one culture can be considered abnormal and illegitimate in other cultures. So I think what we need, there's no generic definition of any of this, but also we have to say what used to be legitimate 500 years ago becomes illegitimate. What is legitimate today may become illegitimate in 50 years. What is illegitimate today or abnormal today may be accepted tomorrow. I think we have to have a very long historical and diverse perspective on any of this, both what I call historically in terms of time and geographically in terms of, geography of today.
So, when institutional regulations outweigh individual expressions, do individuals at some point begin self censoring to meet the professional requirements?
Well, man, individuals always self-censor. They're always, you have to always make assessment about what you're doing. Does it comply? Because every individual needs to think about what they get out of it, what meaning they create. So all institutions regulate and constrain individuals. But again, as I said before, there are legitimate reasons for organizations, institutions to do that. and not all institutions are outdated. So I think this is quite complex because you have to think about what institutions. So when today, we've spent a lot of talking about institutions, but you have to understand there are all kinds of institutions. There are evil institutions. There are good institutions. There are very aggressive institutions. There are very gentle institutions. There are long-term, hundreds of years of old institutions. There are new institutions. So I think when you talk about institutions, we need to think about the diversity of institutions. There's no one generic institution that controls everything.
Professor, you have mentioned that some forms of creativity are not neutral. They may even be negative. So this means that some forms of compliance might be needed. What distinguishes the harmful from the necessary form of compliance?
Well, I think the people make different judgment, but I think the important thing for individuals to consider is that any of your creativity or actions, does it help other people, help humanity, does it hurt? So you have to think about the meaning on other people is not only what you gain, but is what you do, does it help others? I'm always thinking about you realize your value in creating value for other people. You have to think about others. So that's the simple standard is that if you're doing harm to others, you should not do it. If you are doing bad things to our environment, to our culture, you should not do that. I think it's the important thing is other people. We're part of humanity, and humanity has a long history. We need to think about the global, the meta level benefits to other people.
You mentioned that we need to value all forms of human creativity, but when you look beyond the surface, most institutions optimize for what is easily marketable. So what happens to the forms of human creativity that are not easy to market?
Well, I mean, in essence, depending on what you mean by market, everybody has to do something that matters to other people. So when you go to a market, it's not only for money, it's not only for, you know, publicity. There's a lot of things you can do. Like, for example, you and I have this conversation, you want to be on the market. People may not pay you, but they have access to you. So getting attention is also meaningful. But of course, there are bad businesses. They only want money. They sell you the wrong things. They sell you things that don't matter. So again, I want to go back to the idea about what institutions are we talking about. You have to rise above specific institutions. You might be referenced to some industries, some corporations, some government, some religious organizations, but you may reference to schools. So overall, institutions exist for a reason, but that reason we may not agree with, and individuals have to make human level judgment about, do I agree with that reason? Do I want to live with that reason? If not, create a new organization, create a new institution, or join other institutions. So I think there's something that's different. Again, I want to come back to when you start this podcast, you must have a reason to do it. Not only marketing, but you must think you have the talent. You are not happy with existing media. You want to do something different. So that's what you started. So I like this spirit. So that is what I think. The most important thing is to think about how you matter, how you create value for other people.
What happens when societies can no longer imagine beyond approved possibilities?
What collapse? We know a lot of civilizations have collapsed. Think about a human society, human history. We had a lot of great civilizations, the Maya culture, for example, the ancient Egyptian culture. A lot of them collapsed. Why? Because they could not reinvent themselves, because they could not reimagine their future. They're stuck in the past. And if you're stuck in the past, you disappear. So that's what I would like to think the future might be.
Professor Zhao, thank you very much for joining us and for helping us think through this. Thank you, everyone who will listen to this conversation. And the conversation is a part of the season one, the dignity in education, and then an ongoing inquiry into how modern systems shape not only what humans learn, but what kind of humans do these systems ultimately produce. Thank you.
Thank you very much.